talk about the Missouri crisis and the eventual Missouri Compromise and tie that together with Denmark Vesey. This guy does it in this book. I mean, literally, you come to the conclusion of the section on the Missouri Compromise, and then you say Denmark Vesey, next paragraph, same chapter. So tying that together means, among other things, that folks who are involved in the conspiracy, that's all it ended up being, in Denmark Vesey, were aware of the arguments being made on behalf of preventing slavery from moving into Missouri and those who advocated slavery moving into Missouri. So let's begin where we left off last time with the Panic of 1819 and the influence that it may have had on the upcoming election, which it didn't have much influence. The panic did not prevent the re-election of Monroe. There were, of course, some who thought we could use, and this is why people were concerned about the debates in Congress over Missouri. Those who are trying to stop slavery from moving into Missouri, hoping to revive the Federalist Party, which was essentially done for effectively by 1816. So Monroe wins in 1820. His party, he is the inheritor of the Democratic Republican Party, as they're increasingly calling it. Jefferson's old Republican Party. Now, with the combined hyphenated word that a generation before you never used. You never put Democrat or Democratic on a political party in 1800. Absolutely not. But another crisis occurs at the same time to give one-party government, the era of good feelings, a really bad scare. That's the Missouri controversy, which occupies Congress for 2 years and has the potential to split Monroe's Democratic-Republican National Party along sectional lines, which you don't want that to happen. Because 40 years later, that party will split. A Northern Democratic, Southern Democratic. What do you have then? Lincoln's election is basically guaranteed in 1816. In 1819, enough settlers crossed the Missouri River to go into, the Mississippi River, to go into the Missouri Territory. And so it can meet the minimum requirements as a territory to apply for statehood. The territory then asked Congress for the right to have its residents draft a state constitution. Now, that is the process that was established going back to the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. Congress determines statehood. But then there was the question. A question brought up by a congressman, member of the House of Representatives from New York. His name is James Talmadge. February 13th, 1819, James Talmadge proposes that conditions from Congress be attached to Missouri as a state. And that's when everything begins. Those conditions, which are known now as the Talmadge Amendment to the Missouri legislation, are twofold. Number one, stop importing slaves into Missouri. I pronounce it that way. That's how folks in Missouri pronounce it. Unless you live in St. Louis, then it's Missouri. Yeah. I married a girl who was raised in St. Louis, so every time I say Missouri, she's like, no, it says it that way. Well, you do if you live outside the city, which is a lot of the people in Missouri. Anyway, okay, number one. So stop the movement of more slaves into the Missouri Territory. Secondly, those that are already there have already been moved by their owners into Missouri. When they reach the age of 25, they will be free. It's a gradual emancipation law. Now, who is James Talmadge? Well, you don't get a lot of information on more modern books, but the old classic tells you that he is somewhat of an independent Republican. He had in his history objected to statehood in the recently added Illinois. A lot of people in Illinois thought there weren't enough restrictions to make sure that the Northwest Ordinance would be in place. Go ahead.
So, was he from Illinois?
No, he's from New York.
Okay.
Yeah, James Talmadge is from New York. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it would be interesting because him and Lincoln would become friends.
Right, right. And you have to understand Illinois and Indiana. You've got folks who are there who fundamentally oppose slavery, and you have those, and they are called the butternut congressmen because they are from the North, though they support often Southern policies, whether they are senators. Now, in Illinois and Indiana, it falls under the Northwest Ordinance. And Talmadge thought when we approved Illinois, was it Illinois? Illinois as a state, we didn't put in place enough protections to make sure that slavery would not enter the area. It couldn't, but the people writing the state constitution had ways to get around it, like taking black folks there and saying, no, they're indentured servants, that you own forever. They're slaves. William Henry Harrison had been someone who wanted to actually remove some of the ironclad bans on slavery when he was territorial governor. Again, these are, let's go to the map. Why not? When we look at the map here, when we're considering, here we go. Look at where Southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois border. Virginia and Kentucky. So you've got settlers from the established Old South who would settle there. Where's Lincoln born?
Illinois.
Kentucky,
Oh.
slave state. Where's Jefferson Davis born? Kentucky, although we associate him later with Mississippi.
Wasn't Mary Todd Lincoln a slave owner?
Absolutely. I don't know her directly, but family members. Yeah. Henry Clay's from Kentucky. Jackson's from Tennessee. So it's a little bit more complicated than to just say, well, all the Ohio representatives in Congress, the Indiana and the Illinois, would no doubt all oppose slavery. Nope. As would someone from New York or Pennsylvania or New Jersey. They could just as easily vote against the ban, which happened. I'll break down the vote as we go through the whole Missouri question. But again, that's just a reminder we'll keep that map up for a minute or two. Okay. Sorry?
And Arkansas at one point was a free state?
No. It was just left. It was just left as unorganized territory. And at the end of all this, folks looked at it and thought, well, however we divvy up the Arkansas territory, of course, part of it's going to become Oklahoma, a reserve for Native Americans, because Arkansas statehood is 1836. So yeah, you see that compromise line, you're like, that doesn't leave a lot for, slavery to move into. But I think I mentioned last time that there's a general consensus, especially after the Adams-Onee Treaty. This will fall into American hands at some point. It's not a question of if, but when.
The compromise line, it's a weirdly placed because it's DC, Maryland, Delaware is nowhere near the compromise line. So, I just don't understand why they chose that one part of that line.
Well, okay, Delaware and Maryland are already established.
Okay.
Going back to colonial times, states, colony/states. Yeah, the traditional old line would be the Mason-Dixon line, between Pennsylvania and Maryland,
Okay.
that the two surveyors laid out in the 18th century. That's the old traditional colonial north-south line. I know people think Delaware with slaves. Yeah, the start of the Civil War, there were about 500 slaves in Delaware. There were, at the time, in Missouri, 10,000 slaves. There are 10,000 slaves in New York in 1819. Everyone's like, what? Yes, think about it. The gradual emancipation. So Talmadge is taking the New York model, and he's going to apply it to Missouri. Now, if you are a slave born before 1785 or whatever the cutoff was for the gradual emancipation, you're going to die a slave.
Yeah.
Unless you escape by your own freedom or are manumitted by your owner.
Which would probably never happen.
Chances fairly slim, but a possibility. Born after, at your 20 or 25th birthday, and 25 in the case of Missouri, you would be free. So this is what we have to remember about the Talmadge Amendment. It did not free any slaves. It did prevent the movement of more slaves into Missouri. So Missouri was going to join, like New York, technically a free state, where slavery wasn't legal, but there were slaves continuing to live in that territory. It sounds like a lot like New York's gradual emancipation, because it was a lot like New York's gradual emancipation idea.
Could they just call them indentured servants and get around that? Because
Yes, they tried.
Okay. I was just
Tried in Texas too. When the government of Mexico, I'm sorry, at the time would have been Spain, this is before the independence of Mexico, were giving land grants to Americans from Missouri, like, I don't know, Moses Austin, father of Stephen Austin. They were calling those Americans who settled there empresarios, large landowners. They had two restrictions on Americans settling in Tejas, the northeastern section of Spanish Mexico. Adoption of the Catholic faith and slavery, especially when Mexico becomes independent. Mexico bans slavery. So the Americans who have black folks in tow with them, clearly they are slaves, say, oh no, these people are all indentured servants, for life. So the Americans flaunt the laws very effectively. It seemed like a good idea. It seemed like a good idea, but I know this is where I tell the class, by the 1830s, Mexico had a very serious illegal immigration problem on their hands. So yeah, and they couldn't stop it. I mean, the Americans outnumber the Tejanos, and they want self-government. The divide in Texas among the Americans and Tejanos, do we do better staying under the Mexican government, or do we do better becoming independent? And there's a split there. So, but yeah, there is legal precedence for that happening. These black folks are indentured servants. It's like, for how long? Well, as long as I say. So I'm not going to tell you that the North is not a paradise for free people of color. Unlike white folks who move from one state to another, blacks often have to pay a bond when you enter the state, which is unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, and all that. It is. But it was because there was this mindset, racist mindset, that folks settling from one state to another, African Americans, would be a potential threat to the state. They might, of course, foster revolutionary ideas. They might become an economic burden. So if you were white and moved from Indiana to Illinois, you didn't have to do that. So yeah, property ownership or voting was sometimes you were charged a poll tax, which lasted for a long time, unfortunately, and also you had to sometimes hold more property than the equivalent white settlers. So where does that leave us with Missouri? Sometimes we can say a constructive step, which is, okay, there are clearly slaves there in Missouri. They're not going to stop being slaves because Missouri is added as a free state. It can cause a lot of consternation, and the battle lines begin to be drawn, which immediately takes place in 1819. Gradual emancipation can also be tricky. The North uses a lot of morality to attack the system of slavery, invokes religion, as both sides do often, to attack and protect slavery. The South, of course, we're going to find out, has, more surprised than really anyone might have been in 1819, the South presents a unified front against allowing Missouri to join as a free state. It cannot tolerate freedom to slaves in this new area. Jefferson is invoked as well, and he's still alive, by the way. He'll be around until 1826. The two sides begin to rehearse arguments that they would use for the next 4 decades until 1861. When the dust settles, the extension of slavery and the existence of slavery is challenged. Thomas Cobb of Georgia, when he hears about the Talmadge Amendment, says, quote, "You have kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean cannot put out, which seas of blood can only extinguish." There is a scary prediction when you think about it. Let's go back to the notes. Like an overture to an opera, the Missouri controversy prefigures 45 years of sectional conflict. We have it here. It's the first public debate about slavery since, some say, the Constitutional Convention. I would argue the 1790 anti-slavery petitions that the New York and Pennsylvania Quakers introduced in the first session of Congress.
Well, it could also be like, you could say it's from when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Sure.
The first draft. He even said,
Yeah.
like, why don't we free everybody? Because he's like, it says all men are created equal. It kind of contradicts saying, like, yeah, we can own someone because they're different.
Well, here, that's a good point, because here, when we fast forward a little bit to Lincoln and the birth of the Republican Party, he starts the story of America being a natural anti-slavery nation and not pro-slavery. You can find arguments for both. He begins it with the Declaration. He talks about the limits on slavery in the Constitution. He talks about the Northwest Ordinance. He talks about the Missouri Compromise. So at the time when he is making the rounds in Illinois, he is on one side of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to basically blow up and end the ban on slavery from the Missouri Compromise, which had been 30-odd years in the works. And so, yes, he starts with 1776. And he is from, he's born in Kentucky. His family moves him into Indiana first, then Illinois. But either way, he's from a territory state that is part of the Northwest Ordinance. So he uses the Declaration, the Northwest Ordinance, the Constitution, the Missouri Compromise as a way to prove that slavery at all points was attempted to be limited, contained, and eventually done away with. So what is Talmadge's response to Cobb? You have kindled a fire which seas of blood can extinguish. Talmadge says, if a dissolution of the Union must take place, let it be so. If civil war, which gentlemen so much threaten, must come, I say only let it come, unquote.
Did he get to live to see that happen?
I don't know. That's a great question.
He got it perfectly. It's sad but true. He predicted it.
And we see the framing of the debates for the next 4 decades. The Missouri debate revealed, to the surprise of some, that the South was more committed to slavery than ever, that it was somehow a dying institution in the American Southwest, although it was moving very, very quickly through Mississippi, Alabama, and into Louisiana. And to break down the numbers about it, we shouldn't be surprised. In 1814, a field hand cost $400 to $500. In 1820, that price was now $800 to $1,100, more than doubled over the course of 6 years.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. Field hands in 1814, right at the end of the War of 1812, $400 to $500. This is an average, not the rule. 1820, the price went from $800 to $1,100. I cannot give you a modern equivalent. $25,000, $30,000.
To 1,100?
Yeah, would be something close in modern currency. Slave exporting areas like Virginia and South Carolina reacted with horror over the threat that Missouri would not be allowed to join as a slave state. Why? Their side business, which they didn't want to talk about, was selling slaves that they had in excess, because the slave population is growing nearly as quickly as the white population, to settlers, or they took them with them to areas of the new cotton Black Belt.
Was it the North that was surprised from this, that the South?
Yes.
But they could have, no.
Yeah.
It should have been a given, I hate to say it. That's where the South depended most of their colonial.
They don't realize, I don't think, in the North,
How,
they don't realize also something else. This is still, 1820 doesn't change anything from 1860. This is a slaveholding minority in the American South. Lest we forget in 1860 that 25% of Southerners own slaves, 25%, 1 in 4. That means 3 in 4 don't. I mean, we often get caught up. I never want to minimize the impact of slavery on American history, but you have to talk about the reality that 1 in 4 Southern families own slaves. 3 in 4 don't. That tells us something, that there's 4 million slaves in 1860 in the United States, but they are owned by a minority of Southern families, and that slave owners have an overwhelming power in these states.
because they're mostly the ones who are in.
They're in charge.
I mean,
They're in charge, and they put forward a very powerful narrative about if those folks in the North free the slaves, what's going to happen? We're all going to die. After, of course, slaves, attack, murder, rape, and make sure turn the whole South into a mixed race dystopia. The nightmare scenarios that they put out there. Bless you. These are the arguments that are made. Are they ridiculous? Yes, they've been making them, though, for 200 years, ever since Bacon's Rebellion.
But
Race war.
Rape their slave women, and it's okay. But it's bad if the African males rape.
It is the
Yeah.
yes, it is. Yes, it's the unsaid. It's the unsaid. Imagine a wife of a slave owner who has to see and is reminded that her husband may have a whole separate family.
Mm-hmm.
It is unusual, but it does happen. It happened to Thomas Jefferson, who was a widower at the time. Nevertheless, the Hemingses are there. And I mean, talk about changing interpretations of the past. At Monticello, up until the 1990s, the very suggestion that this was happening was completely not accepted until the DNA proves that it's completely different. And fortunately, they have changed the narrative of the history and the complete tour.
Yeah, because you can't gloss over the fact that he was a slave owner.
Right.
We have to admit he was a good man, but in regards of him being a slave owner, that was bad. We can all admit that.
Sure.
But I mean, he's still one of our founding fathers. We can't just gloss over something we don't like.
No.
Because we want him to be a good person.
Right.
And then where do you draw the line? Because Washington was a slave owner.
Washington was a slave owner.
I mean,
We can't even get the Hamilton story straight about whether he was anti-slavery as much as the play and the book would like to claim. There are also Hamilton scholars who say not so much. So you pull the nuance out of the primary documents that you want to, and that's why there are dozens of books written about these folks. Year after year. The new book on Washington says Washington's mother has always been kind of seen as a villain in the whole story. He doesn't write very nicely about her, but now from the perspective of, and you hear a phrase applied that was not used then, that's used now. Well, she was a single mother.
Mhm.
It's like, yeah, she was a widower, and that happened a lot, and she had a host of challenges to deal with, and the interpretations always change. It's an active argument, and that's what makes it all very interesting. So getting back to Missouri, the whole unification of the South voting, as we're going to find out, against the Talmadge Amendment throws off any reservations of the institution dying after the American Revolution, which a lot of people hope, but they were living a lie. It's like the diffusion argument. Oh, move it to new areas and it will weaken. The other problem that we have, the other shock of Northerners from the South, is the South telling Northerners, you're not going to tell us, you're not going to dictate to us in the South how slavery will end. We set that policy, not you. That's That's what we pull out of the debates because they're public, because they're recorded in 1819 and 1820. Very few folks brought up slavery and defended slavery as a positive good, but enough did that we begin to see the shift in the argument. It's a necessary evil. That was what was talked about in 1776. And every excuse was made, and this is where the founders don't get off by modern scholars and observers, and maybe they shouldn't. But if Jefferson, or especially Madison, was here because he not only participated in the national constitution, he was there to the 1830s when Virginia was rewriting their constitution and brought up the whole possibility of increasing manumissions, making it easier for slave owners to free their slaves. And so if he was here, he would say, for the sake of the Union and putting the country together, do you want 6 states or 13? We had to do it. And so that gets back to this entire idea of, for the greater good, it's a nation of free and enslaved. So going back to the necessary evil, this idea that our parents and grandparents brought it over, we don't know how to end it, what are we going to do? And that's the traditional argument. Some start invoking the positive good argument. But for the most part, the idea of the benefits of slavery, not only to the slave owner, but to the slave. And that's what they're going to expand upon for the next 4 decades.
What would be the benefits?
The benefit, it allows Southern culture. It allows the economy to succeed. Whites wouldn't do the work, the drudgery of manual labor that only slaves can do. Well, they used to do it, but then slaves got introduced and whites said we couldn't do it. Slavery rescued the African from the barbarism of the African continent. War, where they were all have a chance to be enslaved. These are the arguments that they are making. I'm repeating the arguments that are being made by pro-slavery advocates. Then we can get into the whole entire scientific thing that Jefferson touched on with people of black skin, brain development, all kinds of just horrid scientific justifications, religious justifications. It's in the Bible. Both sides would invoke the good book to defend and attack.
Slavery in the Bible is a lot different than American slavery. Slavery in the Bible, it lasted.
But it went back so far.
But they didn't stay for life.
Like, you can be highly selective of what you take out.
I mean,
Yeah.
you can't just quote the Bible without trying to consider the whole thing.
But this is what both sides used. So the positive good becomes, I think the shift is at Missouri. Not the necessary evil, but the positive good spin. John Calhoun will invoke it in the 1830s, where slave regimes are now free. He uses the example of Haiti, Saint Domingue. Where you have emancipation, the society plunges into chaos. Well, economic difficulties, certainly, because most of the rest of the world, including the United States, doesn't recognize those countries. I mean, the first and only successful slave rebellion is where? Haiti. It's a model for African Americans. And it's a warning to white Americans who are slave owners or live in the South, because most who live in the South don't own slaves. So what's the other argument that goes back to the justification idea? This is something that happens in Virginia when they give up indentured servants and turn decidedly to African slaves. It's the idea that's perpetuated after 1700 that to be white meant to be free, to be black meant to be enslaved. Mm-hmm. A modern word that they wouldn't use, the segregation. It is a dichotomy based on skin color to represent your status, free or enslaved. Now, the other invoking is if, this is what the minority slave owners told those who were non-slave owners, if emancipation happens, when you have slaves, you have a permanent underclass because they are enslaved. Mm-hmm. Now, folks who defended slavery didn't want to talk about the successful, vibrant, free black communities scattered in the South and in the North.
Yeah.
That didn't fit their narrative. So in the South, you said, if you have emancipation, that economic order where you, poor white trash, are free. You have, a house that leaks when it rains. Your kids wear burlap sacks as clothes, and that's it. But below you is the enslaved class. If emancipation happens, that changes. You might find yourself serving the black owner. Yeah. And so these are the arguments that were made. These are the arguments that were made. How else do you get hundreds of thousands of white men in the South to pick up a gun and either voluntarily or respond to the draft, fight in Confederate armies? Because slave owners are exempt, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Rich man's war, poor man's fight, they started to say. So, okay, back to Missouri. That's okay. We're talking, no, we're getting big picture things that are happening in the United States. The sectional issue from this point on, an argument no one wants to have over Missouri. I mean, Henry Clay's like, he's here, and look at the words. Seas of blood, Civil War, dissolution of the Union. This gives people nightmares in the Congress. James Monroe is probably like, oh no, it's game over for single party, national party government. We'll have a North and we'll have a South. We'll have a party of those who oppose slavery moving to the territories and those that favor it.
And it's still that today. It's still sectional. It's still split between North and South, kind of. But
Kind of.
Because the North is just the North and the South is just.
Well, it's a very different history.
Yeah.
Very different history. I mean, the North was never occupied after the Civil War. The South was. John Price had taught you for a long time, used to say that. I mean, it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
It makes a difference. So again, we also have to understand in the Missouri crisis arguments, it's a mistake to say that Northerners wanted to stop slavery because of humanitarian ideas. It was political, always political. They believe you can control the migration of slaves that cross state lines. They thought the Constitution in 1808 prohibited the international slave trade. We could also put requirements on Missouri statehood after 1808. They also worried in the South, they also worried in the North about the South's ability to influence national politics, and that has to do with the 3/5 clause. Southerners get to count 3/5 of a slave, or a slave as 3/5 of a person, meaning slaves counted for roughly made 60% in the census. So if you have 100,000 slaves, round numbers, 60,000 are counted towards the census. It meant something because Virginians were president for the first 32 of 36 years of the country's history. The 3/5 clause cost John Adams the election in 1800. In 1819, the 3/5 compromise gives the South 17 extra seats in the House. But the South is cognizant of their position too. They're like, oh, that's fine and dandy, and you might complain about it. But in the Senate, we have to keep the balance even between free and slave states. If Missouri were to join, now Alabama was recently added. So now we have 11 free and 11 slave states in 1819. If Missouri joins under the Talmadge Amendment, that makes it a free state, even though there are slaves there, because they're going to prohibit more slaves from moving in. That's going to have 12 free states, 11 slave states, although that's not accurate to say the Missouri senators are going to vote with the North or with the free states. They may not. They probably won't. Probably based on, the people voting there. So there's that consideration as well. But what the Southerners are also talking about is, all right, Missouri joins as a free state. The rest of the Louisiana Territory is going to follow the pattern of Missouri, where slavery can't move into any of the other sections, and that's it. We're in a permanent minority status in the Senate. We're already lost the House. The vote on the Talmadge Amendment is on sectional lines. The North votes for it in the Congress and in the House. The numbers aren't critical for you to know, but it tells the story. if we look at the sectional vote of the Talmadge Amendment, the North supports it, 80-14. The South is against it, 64-2. So this is a sectional vote. So it passes the House. What about the Senate? And there, the South usually relies on the votes from Illinois or Indiana who support the South. This is the butternut senators, as they're called. So it fails to pass in the Senate, the Talmadge Amendment. And the Congress goes into recess in 1819, unable to solve the issue. Both sides then decide they're going to take the case directly to the American people. The leader in the North is Rufus King. Rufus King leads anti-slavery rallies in New York. He is seen as an ally of black voters in the state of New York who have the right to vote. The Republican leadership starts to get worried nationally and especially in New York that they're going to split the party. Or as I said at the very beginning, is this a desperate way that they're going to revive the Federalist Party? President Henry Clay and the Senate Republican, or President Monroe, Henry Clay, and the Senate Republicans, meanwhile, busy themselves over how to end the issue, how to make this entire thing all go away. Get Missouri admitted without any restrictions on slavery. That's the only way they can see it happen. The Senate's never going to vote for the Talmadge Amendment because all the South will vote against it, as well as several Northern senators. Luckily for the nation, the question of Maine statehood is up in the air. Very recently, in 1820, the legislature of Massachusetts had allowed the Maine counties. Maine, you're thinking, wasn't a state? No, it's not. It goes back to being part of Massachusetts since colonial times. And so they get Missouri admitted in the compromise fashion cobbled together by Henry Clay. Missouri will be admitted without any restrictions on slavery. Maine will be added as a free state. And then, of course, there's one more concession, that which you are familiar with. Let me pull up the map one more time. And that is, of course, the fabled 3630 line. There it is. Oop, right there. Across the southern border of Missouri. The remainder of the Louisiana Purchase will be divided so that above the line slavery cannot exist. Below it, it can, leaving for the South only what's now called the Arkansas Territory that borders, well, by this point it would be Mexico and Louisiana and Missouri. Enough Northern congressmen came around to eventually support the compromise. So you voted for the Talmadge Amendment, right? That's going to restrict slavery in the territory. And then you switch your vote when the compromise comes along, because, I mean, it can't be that, oh, Maine's going to join. Something else has to be going on. Why did congressmen who said we support the Talmadge Amendment now say we're going to allow slavery? That seems odd. But enough did so that the compromise measure goes through. John Randolph of Virginia, who's fantastic in so many observations on politics, scorned those 18 who switched their votes and called them dough faces. It's a name that will stick for the next several decades. A Northern man with Southern principles. Apparently it originates from a kid's game where you put dough on your face and look in the mirror and you got scared. Yeah, that's the origin. Or it's also from the idea of you can shape, like dough, a person's politics. There's another expression that comes out of the Missouri Compromise debates. A congressman from western North Carolina, he lives in Buncombe County, stood up and talked. People there were like, look, we want the debate to end and we want votes, procedural votes to take place. He said, I have to stand up on behalf of Buncombe County. And for evermore, The idea of just wasted political bloviating is called bunkum, or bunk for short. Buncombe County. It's an actual place. It still exists. And the dough faces, by the way, paid heavily. Those northern congressmen who voted for the compromise, which allows Missouri to join as a slave state, paid a heavy price, meaning they're going to get voted out the next election. What the eventual compromise did was literally prevent the breakup of the Republican Party. That's one of the real legacies of the Missouri Compromise as it was finalized. It also cemented the power of the Senate. The House had been the important institution in the United States. There were more congressmen than senators. But from 1820 to 1860, we're seeing the Senate, and especially as those three individuals connected to it. Daniel Webster, who would serve in the House and Senate for Massachusetts. Henry Clay, who would also serve in the Senate, move from the House and serve in the cabinet, run for president. And John Calhoun, now nicknamed the Great Triumvirate in that institution. Henry Clay also enhanced his reputation because everyone recognized he was the individual who had brokered the compromise, not President Monroe. So Monroe escapes blame for the Panic of 1819, wins re-election without really any opposition, except I think one person cast a vote for John Quincy Adams, so it wouldn't be unanimous. It's good for Clay. It's good to get the national attention because he is ambitious beyond simply being a member of the House of Representatives or the Speaker of the House, as is basically every single member of Monroe's cabinet. The more important outcome is the startling solidarity of the South against emancipation in Missouri in 1819. It shocked the North. It shocked some because these folks who thought it would hopefully end slavery, they were nicknamed conditional terminators, actually wanted it to continue. By thinning slavery, weakening it, the whole diffusion idea, that's an incorrect idea. The next question happens in Missouri itself. What kind of constitution would the people of Missouri write? So, and that also had to be approved by Congress. Now, the compromise said essentially that slavery would be allowed, and you could not prevent, once the Congress signed off on the compromise, the one thing you couldn't do in Missouri was prevent free people of color from entering the state. And that's exactly what the Missouri State Constitution did. Prevented free Negroes and mulattoes from entering Missouri territory on the eve of statehood. To which Congress got wind of this and said, well, no. You almost undid the Missouri Compromise. So we often say this is part of what's called the Second Missouri Compromise. So this provocative stance where they said, you, if you are a free person of color from Illinois, cannot enter Missouri. It almost undid the compromise. Some vow now in Congress to vote against the Constitution of Missouri, which would prevent statehood. So we talked about the conditions of statehood. We talked about that you cannot prohibit people traveling from one state to the other, and then Missouri goes and does that. So congressmen are standing up saying, no, I'll vote against signing off and ratifying the actual constitution of the soon-to-be, they hoped, state of Missouri. Missouri was violating the part of the Constitution. It's called the Privileges and Immunities Clause. If you're a citizen of one state, you're a citizen of the other states. Well, not maybe officially, but you can't be denied the ability to move.
Where was the state on that?
Sure. Sorry?
What was making that?
Okay, Missouri put in place in its proposed state constitution, which still has to go get approved by Congress, they banned the travel of free people of color and mulattoes into the Missouri territory. That's a violation of, I don't know if it's in Article 1 or the Constitution, but it's the Privileges and Immunities Clause that they call it. And that basically guarantees that if you are a citizen of a state and African Americans in other states, free states, were given that designation, you couldn't deny anyone from moving into Missouri. That's a violation of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. That's like Texas saying, I can't move out of Louisiana into Texas. Now, they're going to require some things when I move there, obviously, but they can't keep me out. If you're a citizen of a state, legitimately, you can move to another state. Your skin color doesn't mean anything about that. Now, this obviously applies only to the North, because that's where African Americans are, again, considered legal citizens. So once that happens, you have to invoke a second Missouri Compromise, which you let citizens, African Americans who are considered citizens, back into the state of Missouri, which they have to change. So that was where we have the second, and this is the fiction and the joke of the entire Missouri Compromise, at least the second part. So to settle it, the second Missouri Compromise essentially said, okay, if you are an African American citizen in another state, you can then migrate to Missouri. Then Missouri proceeded, after the Constitution was signed off on, approved by Congress, to then ban all free blacks unless they were citizens of their own state in Missouri. And Congress kind of said, it's kind of done and settled. Several northern states, and this is the multifaceted, unfortunate part of this development. Several northern states proceeded to do the same thing, preventing free people of color from moving from one state to the other. Then it's official. In 1847, Missouri then banned all free black settlers from ever entering Missouri. So the second compromise comes undone. At that point, you often have pro-Southern presidents, and they didn't do anything about it. We'll introduce this next part of the story and finish it because it deserves not a rushed going through here. We'll also talk next time about the diplomatic achievements of James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, because in the middle of Missouri, in the middle of the panic, you want to go out with a positive legacy. And that's what is attempted by Monroe and company. And it makes, I think, in many ways, some would argue against this, but some would agree, John Quincy Adams possibly the greatest and most successful Secretary of State that we've had. But the debates over Missouri did influence a free black man in his 50s living in Charleston, South Carolina. His name was Denmark Vesey. He was a carpenter, and by 1822, he was a man of the world. You cannot, again, talk about Vesey and not consider where he came from, different areas around the world. He spoke several languages. He had been a slave on the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean. And as a slave, he had been carried to both African and Caribbean ports as a sailor when he was owned. Sometime when he was a teenager, he goes to what can only be described accurately as the hell on earth known as Saint-Domingue, soon to be Haiti. The owner at the time sold him back to the trader who had sold Denmark Vesey to him, one of his subsequent owners. The man who owned him on Saint-Domingue said, he is troublesome, rebellious, I don't want anything to do with him. And sold him back to the trader who tried to unload Vesey and Saint-Domingue. He's in Charleston, South Carolina by 1785, and he is allowed in the urban setting to sell his own time if he gives the money that he earns to his owner, or at least what he admits he gets to his owner. Some of the money he clearly keeps, because Denmark Vesey literally hits the jackpot. In 1799, he wins the lottery in South Carolina, which first hearing that people were like, number one, there's a lottery in 1799. Number two, a black man can play the lottery? And the answer to those questions are both yes. $1,500. To which he approaches his owner and says, I want to buy my freedom. I've not been able to find what the owner said was the price. You know, probably Vesey, smart as he is, probably didn't say, I just won $1,500. What's it going to cost to buy me my freedom? And the owner would say, $1,500. But he has the ability to do that. And with that money, it must have not been all of it, because by the time he buys his freedom from his owner, he is a successful carpenter. He opens his own shop in the Charleston community. The free black community in Charleston, South Carolina is substantial in 1820. We probably think it numbers 3,600 individuals. Vesey worked hard. Vesey saved his money. By 1822, he's worth possibly $8,000. That's a lot of money to have that much coin in your pocket. He's known in Charleston circles as charismatic, determined, but others say something else, ruthless about ending slavery. Determined.
Yeah.
What's that?
Well, yeah, he is. Why wouldn't he be?
I mean, interesting. He's lived a full life at this point. And as far as touring the world, seeing slavery, both black, slave, and free. African Americans who were enslaved, those who were free in the United States were familiar with the debates in Missouri. They heard and they were there. Both enslaved and free people of color were in the galleries in Washington, D.C. to hear the Missouri Compromise debates. Literate blacks, probably a minority in Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, by word of mouth, area, the debates that were up there spread to different parts of black communities. Denmark Vesey cherishes a copy of the Rufus King speech, which supported the Talmadge Amendment. So there you have it. The connection is there. There begins to be talk, and Vesey originates a lot of it, that he was going to use June 14th, 1822 as a celebration. This means something back then. It's Bastille Day.
Mm-hmm.
June 14th, 1822, the symbolic beginning of the French Revolution, Bastille Day in France. He links this French anniversary, not so much to what happens in France, but Haiti, the Haiti Revolt. And to say that the Haiti Revolt, the successful Haiti Revolution, burned in the memory of slaves in the United States is an understatement, if we ever made one. Okay, so how does Vesey plan everything? That's part of the story we're going to pick up next time. I'm going to stop the recording now.